While most in the West continue to stay focused on what's at the end of their nose and the latest news of the day or the latest 24-hour news cycle, especially as it relates to the wars in Ukraine and Russia and in the Middle East between Israel and, well, nearly everybody, there is something else going on in the world which may signal a significant shift and possibly even a tectonic change of the balance of power about where the centers of gravity are in the world today. And there could be significant ramifications for the United States and the Western world at large. And there is literally nobody better to talk to about this stuff and find out what the truth is and what's really going on than Professor John Mearsheimer, international theorist extraordinaire, globetrotter, as we're about to find out here, and just an incredibly articulate individual. John, thanks for coming on the show today.
My pleasure to be here, Danny.
Well, listen, but before we dive into this topic, which is of great interest to me, I'm really eager to hear some of your observations on these things. Referring to my globetrotter comment here, you've just returned from a pretty substantial trip around some of the more important parts of the world, where you were in China and you gave a number of speeches at one of their top government-based think tanks and a number of their universities. You visited with the president of Indonesia, the new president there. They were seeking your guidance and advice on some things, and then even in Doha. And I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about what you talked about and what the world looks like that we're talking about here from Chinese eyes.
Well, I think, Danny, the key thing that I take away from my travels is that once you get outside of the West, you see that views about international politics and the issues of the day that people like you and I have are widely shared. If you ask people what's the principal cause of the Ukraine war, almost everybody you talk to outside of the West says it's NATO expansion. So you have this very interesting situation where people like us are more welcome, or our views are more welcome outside the West than they are inside the West. The second point I would make is it's quite clear when you travel around that most people outside the West believe that people in the West have lost their minds. They just cannot figure out what's going on. They can't understand American policy. For example, people all over the places that I went could not understand why the United States is supporting the genocide, the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And they can't understand why the United States hasn't brought the Ukraine war to an end. They all understand that this is a lost cause and they're deeply committed to seeing it brought to an end, but they think the United States is an obstacle in that regard. So you just have this sense that people think the United States and the Europeans and the Israelis, of course, those three groups are really not behaving smartly at all.
Well, who's to argue with that? Anybody who's willing to look at it, I guess, realistically. We actually had Colonel Jacques Beau on earlier today, who also used that very strong language in saying that he himself was just almost pulling his hair out trying to make sense of why the United States and Europe is taking some of the very actions that you talked about. So one wonders if maybe more people are starting to come to the realization. I don't know if that's more of a hope than an observation, but certainly those outside, as you say, the country are.
Well, I think more people inside the West, more people than ever inside the West, are beginning to question what we're doing. I mean, I think the longer the genocide in Gaza goes on, the more people who are beginning to sort of pop up and just say this is absolutely abhorrent and it has to be stopped. So you're seeing more people speaking out, but still the numbers are not that great. And it's had hardly any effect at all on policy, both in Gaza, with regard to Iran, with regard to Hezbollah, and with regard to the Ukraine war.
Yeah, and we're going to actually dig into all those today. But I want to start off at the top of the show talking about what's in the news, and the BRICS summit has just ended here. And by all accounts, there is, and maybe even fueled by some of these observations that you're saying that other people around the world are making, there seems to be more of an interest in moving over to the BRICS or to almost anything else that looks stable and that has a win-win opportunity to it. And I know that's what a lot of the leadership within the BRICS, especially China and Russia, have been saying. Do you see any of that from your travels?
Yeah, I think what you see going on with BRICS is completely consistent with the discussion that we've just had over the past 5 minutes. Countries outside of the West, certainly countries like China and Russia, Iran, North Korea, just to mention the obvious ones, but also countries like India are deeply suspicious, if not hostile, towards the United States. And they're very interested in creating institutions that are alternatives to the Western institutions. And they're interested in working together to deal with threats from the United States. I mean, this has been obvious for a long time with regard to both China and Russia. They've worked together very carefully, very closely, because they both view the United States as a mortal enemy. But even if you talk about a country like India, in India, there's deep suspicion of the United States. And many people in India do not think the United States is pursuing smart policies, and they don't want to get too close to the United States. And really, in the final analysis, who can blame them? So what's happening is that all these countries outside of the West are trying to figure out ways to deal with the West. And I think that's what you see going on with BRICS.
And of course, it's not something that they can just say, well, we don't like you guys anymore. We're going to go over here, because we do still have one of the biggest military powers in the world. And we definitely have, an economy that's got power that cannot be ignored. And people don't want to ignore it. Actually, they want to benefit from it and have trade relations, et cetera. But at some point, they're starting to say, but where do we want to make sure our bread is buttered primarily, and what's safe, or at the very least, maybe they're trying to diversify and instead of just relying on the United States. And as I argue, this is an entirely self-inflicted wound. And I want to just pick one point here to go back to where I think a big inflection began. Certainly there was, I'm sure anything like this is probably decades in the building, but I want to go back to one specific point here and get your views on the backside of this. This is Joe Biden on the opening day of the Russia-Ukraine war, talking about how we're going to use our military and economic power to crush Russia.
Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposely designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies. We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy. We'll limit their ability to do that. We're going to stunt the ability to finance and grow the Russian military. We're going to impose and we're going to impair their ability to compete in high-tech 21st century economy. We've already seen the impact of our actions on Russia's currency and the ruble. The United States and our allies and partners will emerge from this stronger, more united, more determined, and more purposeful. And Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Any nation that countenances Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association.
Wow. When you hear that, just as the echoes of the BRICS summit are just letting out with all of these nations coming in, doesn't sound like we were very successful there.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's obvious that we have failed to turn Putin into a pariah and isolate him. That may be true in the West, but outside of the West, that's not true at all, as the BRICS summit makes clear. Furthermore, it's quite clear that American policy in Ukraine, contrary to what President Biden intended to do, has failed. There's almost no question about that. Ukraine is in the process of losing the war, which is another way of saying NATO is about to lose the war as well. Biden did not succeed in bringing the Russians to their knees. He did not wreck the Russian economy. If anything, the Russian economy appears to be flourishing. And the Russian military, as General Cavallo, the NATO Supreme Allied Commander, has made clear, is more powerful today than it was at the start of the war. The Russians' military, in other words, is growing in power, not losing power. So what's happened in Ukraine has been a colossal failure for the Biden administration.
Yeah, in fact, I just had a headline up there, or Gary has one ready to toss up there, where we see that where General Cavalli said, "Yeah, they're going to end the war stronger than they were when they went in," and that was one of the big things that we had said, especially in the first year of the war, how terrible Russia had performed, and this just exposed their strategic and operational weakness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then not only has there been now 12 consecutive months where Russia is moving further and further to the west in methodical and now increasingly rapid pace, but the Russian military industrial complex, the size of its force, the training level of its force, the technological advances of its force, both offensive and defensive, are just through the roof. There's another report I saw out in the last week or 10 days that the recognition in the West that the pace and the cycle of Russian iterations of developing technology, counter technology, new technology is just through the roof, whereas we're still back in the Stone Age in a sense. So in every way you want to look at it, they're stronger and we're weaker. Now, when you're talking about what other people around the world see, what impact does that have on a future American, both economic and national security?
Well, there's a distinction, Danny, between power and policy. And I think, and this is consistent with what you said about 5 minutes ago, you were saying the United States is still a remarkably powerful country. That is certainly true. And I think if you go around the world, you see that others understand that. Nobody's arguing that in terms of raw power, the United States has lost its edge. The United States remains a remarkably powerful country. It has a dynamic economy. And if you look at population growth in the future, it should remain as powerful, if not more powerful, than most of the other competitors that it faces on the planet. So everybody understands that. What people question is American policy. They think that our policies just make no sense at all. This applies with regard to Israel. It applies with regard to Ukraine. It applies with regard to our use of sanctions, and so forth and so on. So people question our policies, and they're mindful of the fact that we're so powerful. And what they're trying to do is work around the fact that we're so powerful and create institutions or cooperative agreements that allow them to protect themselves in the face of American power. And in a very important way, that's what a lot of countries are trying to do. They're just trying to protect themselves, defend themselves against American might.
I thought it was very interesting. There's one area to where that Biden said in that 2022 speech that I just played a second ago, and Vladimir Putin actually, I think it was just a couple of days ago, seemed to actually agree on one point. Biden said in that speech that he's going to restrict Russia's ability to use the dollar and to make it more difficult on him. And now Putin said just a couple of days ago, he seems to agree.
В том числе на долларе отражается. Весь мир задумался, стоит ли использовать доллар, если Соединенные Штаты по политическим соображениям ограничивают использование доллара в качестве универсальной международной расчетной единицы. Все задумались об этом. И объем использования доллара медленно, но чуть-чуть сокращается и в расчетах, и в резервах. Даже традиционные союзники Соединенных Штатов сокращают свои.
So now even he said in that second clip there that this is something that's moving slowly. It's not like now that the BRICS summit's over, the dollar's going to fall next week. But how do you see the trends that have been going on, and what are the risks to the United States if it continues?
Well, there's no question that around the world, people are deeply distressed by the fact that the dollar is so powerful in terms of international intercourse or economic intercourse. And, the whole SWIFT system is something that allows the United States to have significant economic leverage over countries all around the world. And they'd like to figure out how they can come up with a system that beats or is an alternative to the SWIFT system and an alternative to the dollar. But doing that is doing that is not easy. It's just very difficult. And it's not clear that anytime soon the Russians and the Chinese working together, or any group of countries working together, can come up with a payment system to replace SWIFT and allow them to escape the real pain that the United States can inflict on those countries.
And is there what are the trade-offs for any of these other countries that may be involved in doing that? Let's look at some of the ones in BRICS. I mean, well, we can just pick India, but there's a number of others also that want to do business with both. You can even take Turkey. Turkey has applied to join. They want to stay in NATO. They still claim that they have aspirations to join the EU, et cetera. But what are the trade-offs and the pros and cons to them wanting to say, let's have an additional place other than SWIFT, but then also still do business with the dollar?
Well, the trade-off is very simple. They just want to get into an alternative system, or be able to access an alternative system where they can get around American sanctions. They can get around American punishment. It's as easy as that. I mean, the fact is, given the power of the dollar and given the SWIFT system, it's very easy for the United States to sanction countries all over the world. And they're looking for ways around that. And as I said before, the problem is that there is no obvious good way to get beyond the SWIFT system at this point in time.
And do you see that trend continuing, or do you see the efforts, will they eventually make success?
Well, I'm not an economist, so I can't say for sure. I mean, you don't want to put too much emphasis on what I have to say about these issues, because this is not my area of expertise. But everything I read says that it is unlikely that an alternative to the SWIFT system will come about anytime soon.
I see. So let's talk about one of the other things that Biden had said in his speech, was that he wanted to make Russia a pariah on the international stage. But as you just mentioned, and this report will show, not a lot of pariah going on around here.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has hailed what he's calling a new multipolar world order after welcoming world leaders to the BRICS summit. The meeting in Russia is the first since the alliance of emerging market nations took on 4 new members: Egypt, Iran, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. On the sidelines of the summit, Chinese leader Xi Jinping and Indian President Narendra Modi are set to hold their first bilateral meeting in 4 years. UN Chief Antonio Guterres is also present. He will sit down with Russian President Putin to discuss the war in Ukraine, a decision that has angered Ukraine's government.
In many of your travels around the Indo-Pacific area there, especially, did you hear any discussions or anybody talking about wanting to see BRICS expand even further than what it is right now?
No, I think that most people understand that BRICS is already very large, and that having more countries in it is a potential danger because it becomes unwieldy at that point. At the same time, they fully understand that the more countries you have, the more it looks like the world is lining up with China, Russia, and India, which are 3 of the key countries that lead BRICS. But I didn't have the sense that, people are spending a lot of time thinking about how to expand BRICS.
And what do you think is I don't know if end state is the right word, but where are things going in terms of what Russia and China in particular, where they want to take this movement here, not just the economic part, but I guess even the intellectual focus on this, Because I think when you look at the world that's existed since the end of the Second World War, which was led by the U.S. primarily and the West in general, we kind of called the shots. Obviously, after the Cold War collapsed, we called all the shots for a few years. And then things started changing where other people start rising, and they don't really like that U.S. only shift. Now, President Putin talked a little bit about that, where he kind of gave his vision of where he wants this to go.
Well, I think it's pretty
Прошедшие 75 лет российско-китайские отношения, уровень всеобъемлющего партнерства и стратегического взаимодействия. И мы можем с полной уверенностью утверждать, что они стали образцом того, как в современном мире должны строиться отношения между государствами. Наше многоплановое сотрудничество носит равноправный, взаимовыгодный и абсолютно неконъюнктурный характер.
So, given what you said earlier about how people around the world are wondering what is going on with American policy and why are they making these decisions, when they hear stuff like Putin said here and like Xi Jinping said in just a second, what is the risk of the Western-led global order that we've seen for the last 75 years shifting?
Well, there's no question that the international order that existed from 1991 after the Cold War up until about 2017 is crumbling. That rules-based order, as we like to call it, was dominated by the United States. The United States basically wrote the rules, enforced the rules, and it was an order that we really liked for all the obvious reasons. But what happened is, starting in about 2017, the world transitioned from unipolarity to multipolarity. And that meant that you had two more great powers in the system. It's not just the unipolar world where the United States was the only great power on the planet. And those two great powers, China and Russia, but especially China, were interested in altering the order, because an order is all about rules. It's all about the institutions that comprise the order. And the Chinese wanted to rewrite the rules. They wanted to create some new institutions. And the end result is that what you see happening today is that alternatives are beginning to develop to that Western-based order that dominated the planet during the unipolar moment. And BRICS is a perfect example of this. BRICS is a powerful institution. It's a growing institution. And what Putin would like to do, Xi Jinping would like to do, and Modi would like to do, not to mention all the other members of BRICS, is make that institution more formidable with the passage of time. And this gets back to our earlier discussion about bringing new members in where there are potential dangers, and also finding an alternative to the SWIFT system, and so forth and so on. But these leaders outside of the West understand full well that if you're going to compete with the West, you need institutions to do that. Or to put it in slightly different terms, you need to create an alternative order.
And what is the risk to the Western world? It's one of the reasons why I'm grateful for your international theorist hat, especially in this part of the discussion here, because a lot of people will see these things going on. They read the headlines, but they think, well, at the end of the day, nothing's really going to change. They're just going to be out there on their own, having their own party, but life will continue on as it would. If you could explain to us, what is the significance of this potential shift, and where do you see it going?
Well, the fact is that you have lots of other countries that are plugging into an alternative order. And there are these alternative institutions out there that the United States doesn't control. And it's in America's interest to dominate almost all of the institutions that exist on the planet. We are a very powerful state. This is why we like unipolarity. And once other institutions pop up, and those institutions become powerful, people are in a position where they can do business inside of those institutions to the detriment of the United States.
Okay, so we see where it is right now. This meeting just ended up. I don't know if they actually formally adopted any new members here, but I think there's a handful that are still on the list to come now. Where do you see this going in let's say the next 5 years?
It's very hard to say. I mean, BRICS is a quite formidable institution, and they're going to work hard to make it more formidable with the passage of time. And if the United States continues to behave the way it has been behaving in recent years, it will go a long way towards helping countries like Russia, China, and India turn BRICS into an even more formidable institution. But I think BRICS is not going away. And if anything, it's likely to become more powerful with the passage of time. And this will create problems for the United States. You want to remember, for example, that Turkey, which is, a member of NATO and has been firmly embedded in the West since the end of World War II, is now in BRICS. And this is not something that the United States is happy about. I think it's in BRICS. It may be applying to BRICS.
Yeah, it's formally applied. Yeah, I don't think the accession has been fitted, but it's definitely formally applied.
Yeah.
One other thing I'd like to ask related to your globe-trotting activities, not just this current trip, but maybe those in recent days, is, and maybe getting to the point you just made about our actions maybe accelerating this shift. When people around the world that you've talked to, when they see that the U.S. is just blindly supporting Ukraine in this war against Russia, against all tactical realities, and just continuing to fund it, to keep the war going, and to give Israel everything it wants, despite all of these international bodies which have said this is a genocide that you can see with your own eyes, children getting blown up and killed on a daily basis, sending more weapons into Taiwan, to sending ships through the Taiwan Strait. So everywhere you look, not to mention these like 700-800 bases we have around the world. They see that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, they see comments from Xi Jinping like this.
We must uphold the three key principles, namely no expansion of the battlefields, no escalation of hostilities, and no fanning flames, and strive for swift de-escalation of the situation. While the humanitarian situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate, the flames of war have once again been rekindled in Lebanon, and conflicts are escalating among the parties. We must promote an immediate ceasefire and an end to the killing. We must make unremitting efforts toward a comprehensive, just, and lasting resolution of the Palestinian question.
So you have China wanting to say, hey, let's just calm things down. Let's find a peaceful way to go on. They see China doesn't, other than some of their aggressive actions in the South China Sea, aggressive actions, not military actions, or at least not lethal military actions, but they don't see them starting wars all over the place. Is this starting, whether it's in the global South, elsewhere in the Asia region, et cetera, is this making people thinking, you know what, I would rather go in a direction of somebody who wants peace rather than this guy who's always trying to kill everybody?
There's a simple answer to that. Yes.
And what are the potential ramifications of that going forward? Harkening back to your initial conversation, that people don't like our policies. Is there any ramifications of that, in other words, or is it that people just got to say, hey, like it or lump it, because that's who we are, and you're just going to have to deal with it? Is there any downside to that for the U.S.?
As we've talked about at great length, these countries are trying to create institutions that are alternative institutions to the American-led institutions that exist. In other words, they're trying to create an alternative order. Furthermore, this is creating all sorts of problems for our diplomacy. The United States would like to have better relations with India. It would like to have India supported on Ukraine and on other issues. But the Indians are deeply suspicious of getting too involved with us. Furthermore, it creates all sorts of problems for us in the Middle East with regard to Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. These countries are irate over our support of Israel, and this is causing us diplomatic problems. It's causing us diplomatic problems among Muslim states in Southeast Asia. So America's behavior has all sorts of consequences. There's no question about that. And of course, this is why people outside of the West are scratching their head and asking themselves, why is the United States doing this? These policies that America is pursuing do not make good strategic sense or moral sense from our point of view.
So, speaking of diplomacy, I'm going to guess that this is one of those head scratchers. It was to me anyway. This is a recent conversation. I think it was going back to the UN General Assembly last month when what's supposed to be our chief diplomat, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, was asked, how are the conversations? How are things going with his counterpart in Russia?
With regard to Minister Lavrov, no, we didn't speak directly, but I was in the room when he made his intervention on behalf of Russia. He was in the room when I made my intervention on behalf of the United States. So I think it's safe to say that we heard each other. I didn't hear anything new, unfortunately, about the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine. It's striking that so many countries that are half a world away in the Indo-Pacific care deeply about what's going on in Ukraine. And the reason, again, is because they know that if any country is allowed to act with impunity and to commit acts of aggression, that's a signal to would-be aggressors everywhere that it's open season. And that's going to be bad for everyone. So, again, I listened to him. Can't speak to whether he listened to me, but I didn't hear anything new.
So, how can you conduct diplomacy if you're literally not even talking to one of your most important strategic adversaries?
Well, you can, but the key point is they're not interested in conducting diplomacy. That's why they're not talking. It's pretty obvious. The United States is not interested in a diplomatic solution to the Ukraine war. And I hope that will change in the foreseeable future. But up to this point, Blinken and Biden have had no interest in talking to Putin and Lavrov.
And what is the end game there? How does that, even in their I guess in their minds, how does that help the United States by not engaging with anybody else and just letting events run their course? Is there an end state to this? I mean, do you even have an idea what their thinking might be?
No. For a while, you could make the argument that they believed that Ukraine would turn the tide, that Ukraine working with the West would create a situation on the battlefield where Ukraine had the upper hand and began to push the Russians back, and therefore there was no need for diplomacy. You could understand that way of thinking, but to me, and I know this is true for you as well, it's manifestly clear that the balance of power has shifted decisively in the Russians' favor. And that if anything, Ukraine is just going to lose more and more with the passage of time. One would think in those circumstances that the administration, the Biden administration, would be reaching for diplomacy, trying to figure out some sort of diplomatic solution that can put an end to this war and minimize the damage that's done to Ukraine and to NATO. But we're not doing that. So what you see is that we're in a situation where the Ukraine war is continuing to turn against us and to turn against the Ukrainians, yet we just continue to dig deeper. We don't turn to diplomacy. We just continue to fuel the war as much as we can. And when you add all this up, one can only say, what are these people thinking? This just doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, one wonders if perhaps reality is starting to dawn on some people. At least we haven't taken some of the bigger bad positions we could have of recent times. For example, you had Volodymyr Zelensky come to Washington at the Washington summit at the 75th anniversary of the NATO summit, really seeking to get some kind of MAP, a map of where they could get into NATO membership. He wanted some kind of commitments. He got nothing. Then he came back to the UN General Assembly, wanted to be able to get permission to use long-range rockets, and again, was kind of hoping for NATO. He got nothing. And then I think a week or so ago, to his Rada, to his parliament, he gives this victory plan, which has point number one: join NATO now. In response to that, so far, everybody has been kind of cool to it. And when specifically asked, the new NATO Secretary General added this.
But the victory plan is not only about an invitation to become a member of NATO. The victory plan has more elements, as today President Zelensky has explained to his parliament. And obviously this is always part of a debate which is ongoing. What I have made clear in Kyiv is that ultimately NATO membership is the sovereign right to ask for every nation which is somehow part of our geography. And the only ones deciding on it are the 32 members already in NATO and the one country who wants to become a part of NATO. And therefore, let there be no doubt that Putin or Russia have no vote on this, have no veto on this. This is really a discussion which is ongoing between us and Ukraine.
So it's first of all interesting to note that he didn't say anything about some of the NATO members who are ready to say no, not the least of which is Viktor Orban from Hungary and Fico from Slovakia and a number of others. Maybe even the United States and Germany are not willing to say that. But he actually didn't answer the question of, is NATO going to let him in or not? But so all that does is just kick the can down the road. And I wonder, and this may be another where you just have to scratch your head and say, I don't know. But could it be that we're not wanting to address that because of the pressure that the Biden administration may be putting on to say, let's don't even talk about this until after November 5th. Then we can start to try to figure something out. Otherwise, where are we going to go with this?
Well, 2 points. It's more than kicking the can down the road. It's actually making a bad situation worse, because you're basically telling the Russians that the option of bringing Ukraine into NATO is still on the table. And that's just going to incentivize the Russians to do even more damage to Ukraine, to take more territory, and make sure that Ukraine in the end is a truly dysfunctional rump state. So this is completely counterproductive. And the idea that Putin doesn't have a vote here is simply wrong. Putin has made it very clear that he will go to enormous lengths to make sure that Ukraine never joins NATO. And I don't think there's much that the Americans and the Europeans can do to fix that situation. So this is a real tragedy. One other point, you want to remember that the Biden administration is almost history. Biden will leave the White House in January of 2025. And it's hard to imagine whether Kamala Harris, and certainly if Trump wins, will keep Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and Lloyd Austin. That's not going to happen, in my opinion. And you're going to get a new team in there. This tells me that there's just not much time left for the Biden administration to, change course and try to fix the problem. So I think what you're going to get between now and January 2025 is just more of the same. And the only thing that might change the situation radically is if the Ukrainian military were to collapse in the face of the Russian offensive. Then the Biden administration would be faced with a radically different situation than exists now. But otherwise, I think what Biden and company will do is just, maintain the status quo moving forward.
And what about Volodymyr Zelensky? So he's been on all these, and he went on a European tour in addition here in the last week or so, also trying to get permission to do all kinds of things. And he's literally come away with nothing. He has gotten a few military packages, both from the United States and the UK and the European Union, gave him some money, which keeps the war on life support. But there is, as you've said earlier so eloquently and emphatically, there is no military solution even to hang on. So where does Zelensky go with this if he's not getting the things that he thinks he actually needs to change the dynamic? And he himself, better than any of us, can see his military literally disintegrating by the week.
I mean, it's hard to figure out what he's thinking. As you and I have discussed before, you would think if you were playing his hand that he'd try to work out some sort of diplomatic solution, put an end to the war, and get as good a deal as possible. That's the logical thing to do, given that they are losing on the battlefield and there's no way of altering the existing balance of power. And indeed, if anything, the existing balance of power is going to get worse for Ukraine. But he's not gone in that direction at all. And he's just hanging on and continuing to make arguments and put forward policy proposals that make zero sense, in my opinion. I don't understand, what he's talking about when he introduces this victory plan. It's delusional. It's just not going to work. But that seems to be what he's up to. And at some point, who's to know where that point is? He's either going to be overthrown from within, or events on the battlefield are going to force him to change course, or going to force Ukraine to change leadership. But this is, his policy approach is not sustainable over the long term.
Yeah, that's really the bottom line. It's not sustainable. Before we shift gears here, I want to hit something in the Middle East before we let you go. But the last thing, I wonder if maybe you can provide some sort of even plausible reason behind what Zelensky and the Ukraine side has been doing in this Kursk offensive. So now, when this thing first started in the 1st of August, it was ostensibly to make Russia hurt, to show them that we're going to take the war into your own territory, and to cause the Russian side to have to redeploy forces off the Eastern Front. Well, that was a spectacular failure because the Russians continued. In fact, since that time, it's ironic, the Russian pace of operations in the East has increased. The number of square kilometers they have recaptured has risen in faster proportion than it did prior to this Kursk operation. Meanwhile, if you actually look at the Kursk option itself, it's continuing to shrink, and it looks like Russia's trying to go after the neck of that to cut off the resupply routes that they have to go inside there. There is nothing that they can do but to benefit from this. And yet, instead of withdrawing their troops and bringing them back into some of these other fronts that are collapsing faster, they continue to send reinforcements and logistics and everything else into this. What possible reason do you think they could have to do that?
Very hard to say. I mean, I was never clear on why they invaded Kursk to begin with. You want to remember that in a war of the sort that's playing out in Ukraine, it's better to be on the defensive than on the offensive. If you're on the defensive, you can be down in a trench or down in a foxhole, and you have a lot of protection. And if you're on the offense, you're out in the open and you're vulnerable to the adversary's artillery and air power. So if I'm playing Ukraine's hand, I don't want to take the offensive unless I absolutely have to. And I want to remain on the defensive. But what the Ukrainians have done by invading the Kursk region is they've gone on the offensive. And the end result is they lost massive numbers of armored vehicles and artillery, and huge numbers of Russian troops have been slaughtered. And at the same time, as you were saying, Danny, they've pulled troops off the Eastern Front where they were badly needed. They've weakened themselves on the Eastern Front, and they've allowed the Russians to gain more territory than ever. And not only gain more territory, kill more Ukrainians than ever, because they're more badly outnumbered on the Eastern Front than they were before the Kursk offensive. So in terms of just casualty exchange ratio, this offensive in the Kursk region, if anything, just shifted the casualty exchange ratio against Ukraine even more than it was before that operation began. So it just makes no sense at all. And one could argue, and this is what you're getting at, that what they ought to do is just pull out of Kursk and solidify their border with Russia in that region, and send the remaining troops to the Eastern Front where they can possibly help stem the tide there.
Yeah.
It seems to me the logical thing to do. If I had been in charge, by the way, in 2023, I would not have launched the famous counteroffensive or offensive that they started in early June of 2023 and that lasted through the fall of 2023. That, of course, was wildly unsuccessful at capturing territory, which is what most people paid attention to. But the more important point is the Ukrainians then were on the offensive. And again, when you're on the offensive and you're out in the open, you're vulnerable to Russian drones, Russian artillery, and Russian air power. You're going to die in large numbers. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And again, they basically took the offensive again when they launched the Kursk offensive. And again, I don't think this made strategic sense.
Now, I hadn't seen any. I just wondered if perhaps you saw something I didn't see. Want to shift gears here to the Middle East, if we could, in the last bit of time we have here. I think that prior to us coming on the air, you and I real briefly talked about this intelligence report that has allegedly been leaked, showing that Israel was preparing to go on a big offensive potentially against Iran. And there's been some question that because there hasn't been this attack now, so Israel hasn't launched since the October 1st attack that came in from Iran, that maybe this intelligence actually has prevented them from making this attack. What do you think about that?
Well, there were two documents that were leaked, and these were well above top secret documents. These were code word documents. Limited number of people had access to these documents. And the documents told you a lot about what kinds of weapons the Israelis were intending to use and what their preparations looked like. But as best I could tell from looking at the documents, it wasn't clear what the target set looked like in Iran beyond going after radars and intelligence installations in Iran. And I think that no matter what the ultimate target set is inside of Iran, you are initially going to go after the radars, the air defense radars, and the intelligence installations, all for the purpose of cutting a corridor into Iran. So no matter what the attack is, I think that those sorts of targets that were mentioned in these documents were just obvious ones and would apply to any kind of offensive. But the big question we ask ourselves is whether or not they're going to go after Iran's nuclear facilities. They're going to go at whether they're going to go after Iran's oil facilities. Here we're talking about the refineries and the oil fields, or if they're not going to go after those two sets of targets, what kinds of installations, what kinds of population centers, if any, are they going to target? And I don't think those documents told you anything about that ultimate target set. So the argument that some people are making today that the Israelis are delaying the attack because this important information has been leaked to the Iranians, who can now prepare themselves better for an Israeli attack, doesn't seem to make sense to me. Maybe I'm missing something here, but I don't think much was revealed in those documents about what the Israelis are ultimately planning to do against Iran.
In fact, we recently showed on the show here that former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett strongly advocates the very target list that you just mentioned there about both nuclear facilities and energy facilities, because he's claiming this represents a once in a 50-year opportunity, et cetera. And he's not alone in that. We had John Bolton, who went out a couple of days ago and tried to push that line.
I don't buy the argument that they have necessarily agreed not to attack the nuclear and oil facilities. I think the nuclear program is a military program, and indeed it's the most dangerous program, not just for Israel, but for the United States, and as a matter of counter-proliferation policy, really dangerous for the world as a whole.
And how do you view that? I mean, let's look at whether they do or whether they don't hit that. What are the ramifications to the region if Israel does that? Because that would be a lot more than anything that's ever happened in between Iran and Israel before.
Well, the first point to make is that almost everybody I know believes that the Israelis by themselves cannot destroy Iran's nuclear capability, that they need the Americans. And even if the Americans are involved, it's not clear that the Americans and the Israelis together can destroy all of the nuclear facilities inside of Iran. But let's assume that that's not the case, or let's assume that the Americans and the Israelis together can destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. If that were to happen, what the Iranians would do is they'd redouble their efforts to build new facilities and eventually get the bomb. There's no way we can take out Iran's nuclear capabilities once and for all. By the way, this is the reason the United States did not launch a preventive war against Soviet nuclear facilities in the early 1950s. You want to remember that in 1949, the Soviets exploded their first nuclear weapon. We then thought long and hard about going after their nuclear facilities and destroying them. And we decided it didn't make much sense to try to do that because the Soviets would ultimately rebuild all of those capabilities that we destroyed, and they'd get the bomb. And the end result is the Soviets would have nuclear weapons and be mad as hornets. The same basic logic applies here. You can go in and maybe destroy their nuclear facilities if it's the Americans and the Israelis acting as a tag team. Maybe you can destroy all those existing nuclear facilities, but that's not going to prevent Iran from ultimately getting the bomb. And in fact, it's going to give Iran an incentive to get the bomb. The Iranians have not yet made a decision to get nuclear weapons, as best we can tell. We're quite confident of that. And I believe that if we were to hit those nuclear facilities with the Israelis, or even if the Israelis do it alone, they are very likely to decide they need nuclear weapons to deter a future attack of that sort. And if the Iranians get nuclear weapons, the Saudis have made it clear they're going to get nuclear weapons. And if the Saudis and the Iranians have nuclear weapons, you can rest assured that the Turks, the Iraqis, and the Egyptians are going to think long and hard about getting nuclear weapons of their own. And that proliferation process across the entire Middle East is not a situation that we want to see happen. But that's the consequence, I think, of going after their nuclear capabilities. So I, again, don't think this makes much sense, but that's not to say that the Israelis won't try to do it.
And that's like the medium / long-term ramifications that you're describing there. What about the immediate reaction? The Iranian defense minister and I think the Ayatollah have all publicly been pretty outspoken that if Israel comes in and hits something hard and kills a lot of people, that they are going to take off the restraints that they have had in April and on October 1st and hit something even harder in Israel. To what extent do you think Israel would be at risk if Iran makes good on its threats?
Well, I think it's quite clear. If you go back to the April attacks, that was the first set of attacks. Remember, on April 1st, the Israelis attacked the Iranian embassy in Damascus, and then the Iranians retaliated on April 14th. And it was a choreographed retaliation because the United States and Iran wanted to make sure that the two of us didn't get dragged into a war. So it was actually somewhat limited. And then the Israelis retaliated on April 19th with a small retaliation. We put great pressure on them not to retaliate overwhelmingly. So that April 1st, 14th, and 19th set of attacks and counterattacks was the first iteration of this conflict between Iran and Israel. And then on July 31st, the Israelis killed Ismail Haniyeh, the Palestinian leader, in Tehran. So the Israelis attacked Tehran, and the Iranians said, we are going to retaliate. And that retaliation came on October 1st. And by all accounts, there was somewhere in the vicinity of 180 plus ballistic missiles that were targeted at Israel. Now, what we're waiting for is the counterattack by Israel. That's what we were talking about before. So you have July 31st, October 1st, and at some point in the not too distant future, there will be a counterattack by Israel. As you point out quite correctly, Danny, the Iranians have made it clear that when Israel retaliates or counter-retaliates, the Iranians will counter-retaliate. And then the question you have to ask yourself is, what will the Israelis do? And in all likelihood, they will counter-retaliate. And what's happening here is we're going up the escalation ladder, and where all this leads, who knows? And it could be the case, by the way, that the Americans do get dragged in. And it could be the case that the Americans and the Israelis decide, as you're going up the escalation ladder, to go after Iran's nuclear sites. I'm not saying that's likely to happen. In fact, I think it's unlikely, but it is plausible. It is a plausible scenario. But more generally, it's just very hard to tell how we end this escalation between the two sides, which of course the Israelis have intended from the beginning. This is very important to understand when we talk about the April attacks and when we talk about the more recent set of attacks, that both of those were initiated by Israel, because Israel is deeply committed to dragging the United States and Iran into a shooting war. And the Iranians and the Americans up to now have been deeply interested in avoiding
Not
that.
doing that. But yeah, tell me something from the Israeli point of view. You talked a bit earlier that a lot of people around the world are puzzled about U.S. policies and what they're doing. But I'm going to have to put myself in that category on what the Israelis are doing, because if it were only talking about whether they should or shouldn't go after Iran, I mean, I think that would be a terrible idea, just because, as you literally just said, there's no apparent end state to it. There's no end game. It's just like we're just going to keep tit for tat, and then probably each round goes up higher and higher. But it's not the only game that's going on. I mean, they're still fighting in the Gaza Strip against Hamas after now in the 13th month. They have this open-ended situation going on with the Houthis in Yemen, and then there's increasing violence in the West Bank, and now then going into southern Lebanon. This apparently is a lot more than just clearing out the border, as Yoav Gallant said.
רואים ממש פרוס לפנינו את כל קו הכפרים הראשון של חיזבאללה. מה שמאפיין את המקומות האלה זה שכל אחד ואחד מהם זה יעד צבאי ומוצב תת-קרקעי עם הרבה מאוד מנהרות, עם אמצעי אמל"ח. מצאו פה מאות RPGים, מקלעים, טילי נ"ט, ואת כל הדברים האלה צה"ל משמיד עכשיו, יעד אחר יעד, מתחת לאדמה ומעל לאדמה. כל מקום כזה לא רק שיושמד, אלא שלא מאפשר את חזרתם של המחבלים אל תוך המקומות האלה. זה דבר חיוני על מנת לשמור את ביטחונם של תושבי הצפון.
And when you look at the map of where they have given orders for people to evacuate, it's way up into southern Lebanon. And of course, there are many people in Israel who are claiming that they want to occupy that land. They don't want, and I mean like settle it, not just, get the Hezbollah out, but actually, we'll just take this. Whether that's going to happen or not, who knows? But I'm just looking militarily, all of those different fronts that they have already committed themselves to, whether we do or whether we don't join in, how can Israel actually ever get out of these conflicts?
Well, let me just take what you said and put it into a broader context. I interpret you to be saying quite correctly that the Israelis have not prevailed in Gaza. They have not prevailed against the Houthis. They have not prevailed against Hezbollah. And in all three of these cases, there's no evidence that they are going to prevail anytime soon. So the question then is, why are they starting a war involving Iran? Because I think you and I agree there's no way they can win a war against Iran in any meaningful way. The Israelis are talking about reordering the Middle East, creating a new Middle East that's user-friendly to Israel. This is delusional. I mean, given the status of the war in Gaza, in Lebanon, and with regard to the Houthis, and with regard to what a war with Iran will look like, there's not going to be any new Middle East that looks good from Israel's point of view. Just not going to happen. So this raises the question, why pick a fight with Iran? It just doesn't seem to make much sense. I can offer at least two plausible arguments as to what's going on here. Number one is that Benjamin Netanyahu cannot afford peace. He needs constant war, and therefore what he has to do is escalate everywhere. Just increase the number of conflicts that Israel is fighting, because the more dangerous the situation looks to the Israeli body politic, the more likely he is to have good ratings and stay in power. That's one possible explanation. The second possible explanation, and this is one I think you don't want to underestimate, I think the Israelis are primarily concerned with ethnic cleansing in Gaza and ultimately in the West Bank as well. The Israelis are deeply committed to driving as many Palestinians as possible out of Greater Israel. And I think they believe that a general conflagration, presents the best opportunity to do this. You want to remember that the two great ethnic cleansings of the Palestinians by the Israelis took place first in 1948 and second in 1967. And both of those cleansings took place in the context of a war, the War of Independence for Israel in 48, and then the Six-Day War in 1967. I think that a good number of Israelis believe that if you have a general conflagration, Iran's deeply involved fighting a war against Israel, the United States is on Israel's side, that provides an opportunity for the Israelis to cleanse the Palestinians, which is their most important goal by far, in my opinion. I don't think they're that concerned about Iran. They're concerned about Iran, but Iran is of secondary importance. It's the Palestinian problem that they would like to solve. They'd like to cleanse the Palestinians from Gaza. And by the way, this is why Netanyahu won't agree to any sort of agreement or ceasefire in Gaza. He wants to finish the job. He wants to drive the Palestinians out. And again, I think that one could make the argument that this is one reason he and his lieutenants welcome a war with Iran.
Wow, that's deeply distressing because I don't see any prospect of them attaining those objectives. I think that the means that they have to achieve those ends, I just don't think it's going to work, and I just fear what may come in the region if they try.
Well, I mean, it's just hard to see how the wars in the Middle East that Israel is now waging come to a happy ending. I don't see any story that one can tell about how they all end. And very importantly, because of the power of the Israel lobby in the United States, we are joined at the hip with Israel. These are not just Israel's wars, they're America's wars as well. And the end result is that we're stuck in these various conflicts that have no solution and cause us all sorts of problems, not only in the region, but around the world, as we were talking about before. And then when you marry this discussion that we're now having to what's going on in the Middle East, to what's going on in Ukraine, and what a disastrous situation that is, not simply for the Ukrainians, but also for the West, and this, of course, includes the United States, you see that we are really in deep trouble. And we don't have any simple way of fixing these problems in the short term or even in the long term. It looks like these problems are going to just hang on for as far as the eye can see. And this is not good for the United States.
Right. Yeah, that's one of my driving imperatives, to even bring situations up like this and discuss these kinds of things, to, I think, to highlight the irrationality of it, and hopefully to show a path that this is not just a dead end, but a dead end with a big fire going on inside of it that you're going to drive into if we don't change course really quickly. And I don't know if it's just hope against hope that whether it's a Harris or a Trump administration, that they'll try to start actually counting the cost and thinking, all right, it's time to do something different. We can only hope, and hope springs eternal, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know.
We'll see. Yeah, no, there's really nothing good. Yes, that may also be delusional on my part, but we'll have to wait and see how things work out. But in any case, we are very, very grateful to having you on today. Thank you so much for coming on to provide these really lucid insights.
And depressing insights, I might add.
Sometimes that's what the truth is. But the truth, nevertheless, and that's what we're all about. We're unintimidated and uncompromised, and whether we don't like it or not, this is the truth, and we're going to keep bringing it to you. And we're also going to bring it to you on podcast. And if you aren't able to watch all of our shows on the video here, you can go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, anywhere you get your podcast. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will be sent right there. Thank you very much. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that already. More helpful than you may think. And we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.